We have about 6,000 members in the Atlas experiment, and about half of those are scientific authors on the papers.
Right.
And they come from, I'm not actually sure what the latest numbers are, but I think about 170 institutions from across the world, about 40 countries or so. So it's a truly global collaboration.
You've just heard Christian, my guest for today, and we're going to talk about one of the biggest experiments in science today, and certainly in particle physics, the experiment called ATLAS. Just think of the number of people involved in this experiment alone, which is 6,000, as Christian just said. Well, that's the size of a small town, isn't it? And the detector itself is the size of a big multi-store house. But what is it they actually do there, and what does the work of researchers and research software engineers like Christian look like? Well, I hope you all get a glimpse of that in this week's episode of Code for Thought. Before I go into the interview, let's set the scene for a little bit. Particle physics looks at the elementary building blocks of matter and the mechanisms and kind of forces that puts together these particles into the matter we know. Our view of elementary particles has changed completely over history. Long gone are the days when we had 4 basic elements: earth, wind, water and fire. Dmitry Mendeleev created the first version of the so-called periodic table in the 19th century, where the building blocks of matter were ordered based on chemical properties. These elements were called atoms. An atom, in Greek, means indivisible. But it turns out that atoms really aren't indivisible at all, because they consist of a core called nucleus and particles that orbit the core called electrons. The nucleus itself isn't indivisible either. It consists of 2 kinds of elements, the protons with a positive electric charge and electrically neutral particles called neutrons. And the electrons themselves have an electric charge as well, a negative one, and there are an equal number of electrons with a negative charge as there are protons with a positive one, so that seen as a whole, an atom appears to be neutral. So far, so good. But in the course of the 20th century, experiments have shown that the number of elementary particles, that is, particles that cannot be broken down into smaller bits, is far larger than anybody thought. Take our protons and neutrons for a minute. In the 1960s, 2 physicists, Murray Gell-Mann and Georg Zweig, predicted the existence of so-called quarks that make up a proton or neutron. A theory that got confirmed in the late 1960s at an experiment at the Stanford Linear Accelerator in the US. The quarks in question were simply called up or down, and they have a partial electric charge, so that 2 up quarks and 1 down quark form a proton, and 2 down quarks and 1 up quark build a neutron. Well, since then 4 more quarks were discovered with such exotic names such as strange, charm, top and beauty. And on the side of the electrons, well, they've got some siblings as well now, like for instance the muon. As more particles were discovered, a new physics model emerged, the so-called Standard Model, which tries to put the entire zoo of elementary particles into a cohesive pattern, very much like Dmitry Mendeleev tried to do that for atoms. And at this moment, the Standard Model is our best shot of understanding what actually makes matter and how it is being put together. All of this was possible through a range of physics experiments that tried to probe deeper and deeper into the very nature of matter. And as physicists started to go deeper and found more exotic particles, the experiments themselves started to grow more and more complex. And not only in terms of the hardware they needed to build particle detectors with, but also with regards to the sheer amount of data they started to collect and the detailed data analysis they had to perform on them, which required a lot of computing, of course, and software engineering. And this brings me finally to the experiment ATLAS. ATLAS is one of several experiments at the LHC at CERN that look at collisions between protons at speed close to the speed of light. But first the protons need to be brought up to that speed, and this happens at the largest particle accelerator to date, the Large Hadron Collider, or LHC for short. Hadron, by the way, is a name for a group of particles to which the proton belongs. And CERN, as many of you know, is the European Particle Physics Lab, which is based near Geneva in Switzerland, close to the French border. As I said, ATLAS is not the only experiment that feeds off the particle stream provided by the LHC. Other experiments, for instance, include the experiments CMS and LHCb. And in case you're wondering what the names stand for, CMS is short for Compact Muon Solenoid, muons being the elementary particles I mentioned earlier, and LHCb stands for Large Hadron Collider Beauty, where beauty refers to one of the 6 quarks. And to be honest, even ATLAS is put together from the following words: a toroidal LHC apparatus. Well, this sounds a lot less impressive, doesn't it? I think ATLAS is a well-chosen acronym because it invokes images of something very big, like the mountain range in North Africa or the mythical creature from Greek mythology. And the ATLAS experiment and detector certainly live up to that image. And in order to manage all of that, you need, of course, a lot of technicians, physicists, software engineers, or engineers in general, people like Christian. And in the first part of our conversation, Christian and I go through ATLAS in a bit more detail and what does it actually mean when you smash protons into each other at high speed, and how you would measure all of that. So here it is.
I'm a particle physicist working on the ATLAS experiment and have worked with the Physics and Astronomy group at UCL for many years. And I've recently transitioned to the Center for Advanced Research Computing at UCL to work properly as a research software engineer and focus on the software.
Right, exactly. The transition from physics to software, that sounds familiar. Since when have you been involved with ATLAS?
Since 2011. I
Right.
think I started out as a summer student. I took part in CERN's summer student program. And that got me into ATLAS, and then I did a PhD also on ATLAS, and then postdocs and whatnot, and it just was too excited to leave.
There. And you were then accepted to the collaboration? Or,
yeah, that's right.
Right, as a particle physicist.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So I'd like to start with ATLAS itself.
Yeah.
First, the size of the project team itself. When we talk about project teams, people have sizes of maybe 20, 30 people, but I think there's a few more in ATLAS.
Yeah, ATLAS is a bit larger than that. We have about 6,000 members in the ATLAS experiment, and about half of those are scientific authors on the papers.
Right.
And they come from, I'm not actually sure what the latest numbers are, but I think about 170 institutions from across the world, about 40 countries or so. So it's a truly global collaboration.
And were you at UCL when you started?
Yes, I was, kind of. I mean, I just had done a master's at UCL. I went to CERN over the summer to get a first sort of experience as a summer student and technically employed by CERN then. But then I went back to UCL for my PhD. So
were you actually directly at CERN, as employed by CERN?
Yeah, for the duration of the summer.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah,
it's a really nice program for students to get experience and sort of dig into what it's like to be a particle physicist and how the whole thing works. This is a really nice program.
Particle physics is exactly the subject that I want to move on to next. ATLAS obviously is a particle physics detector, and we're talking about proton collisions at high energy. But what does it actually mean, and why does that matter?
Proton collisions at the LHC allow us basically to study the fundamental building blocks of the universe. And they allow us to recreate conditions in a way that they haven't naturally existed since shortly after the Big Bang. And the protons at the LHC are collided in a circular collider to nearly the speed of light, and then they're smashed in 4 interaction points. And there's experiments built around those 4 interaction points, and one of those is the ATLAS detector that I'm working on.
Right, and I think what happens then if the protons smash into each other at very high energy, they kind of fragment, don't they? Because protons, as I remember, they're built themselves of particles called quarks.
That's right, yeah.
And then they form some kind of a whole cascade of intermediate particles. And it's that we're looking at, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. The protons itself are the stable matter that makes up a large fraction of the universe. But when we collide them, then they break apart, and we can really study subatomic particles, quarks and gluons, and potentially some particles that we haven't even discovered yet.
The protons fly at all close to the speed of light. They can't probably fly exactly at the speed of light because that would turn the mass into something indefinite.
That's right.
But what is the energy actually? How can we envisage that?
So from a scientific point of view, the energies currently of the protons are 6.8 tera electron volts, which, because you have two beams, that then gives you 13.6 tera electron volts, or TeV as we say. And that number doesn't necessarily mean much to you, but essentially, if you think about a mosquito flying around, that mosquito on a human scale will have about 1 trillion times more energy than the protons that we collide. So the human scale is not that much energy. But the main difference at the LHC is that all of that energy is then collided into a space that is smaller than the size of the proton. And that really allows us to study what happens in extreme conditions.
Right, okay. It's the confinement in space. It's focused.
That's right.
The focused energy rather than sort of the diffuse energy when the mosquito flies around.
Exactly.
And in order to detect all of that, the Atlas detector itself consists of a number of different components. I mean, it's as large as a house, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. And it's sort of built like, you can imagine it built like an onion. It's got different layers around it. So we have the what we call the inner detector, which is essentially works a bit like a camera, like a photo camera. And it tries to track the charged particles that bend in the magnetic field and try and recreate that track and measure that precisely.
Is that the jet drift chamber?
It's made up of a number of sub-detectors, even that. I don't want to go to that level of detail. It's a bit more complicated. I'm simplifying things here. But the inner detector is essentially very good at tracking charged particles that bend in a magnetic field.
Right.
And then around that comes essentially come the colorimeters, and they're very good at absorbing as like a crash mat, where they try to absorb as much as possible, and it allows us to infer what the energy of these particles was.
Hence the name.
That's right.
Calorimeter.
Yeah, that's right. And then even around that is the very big muon spectrometer, which is very good at measuring muons. And muons are basically the heavy cousins of electrons. And they're special because they basically traverse through almost the entire detector undetected, and we need a special detector to catch them at the end.
One of the big outcomes, I think, that people might remember is the discovery of the Higgs boson.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's not the only physics that happens there, isn't it? Because we have something like the weak interaction and the weak coupling, etc. And I think there has been a lot happening in that respect.
Yeah, it's a very broad physics program trying to measure precisely what we think we understand about interactions at that scale. And we have a theory for that. It's called the Standard Model of Particle Physics, which is currently our best theory for what happens down there. And it is really successful. It's very good at reproducing what we actually see in the data, but it has a few flaws and a few things that it can't explain. And so we were really trying to figure out where it breaks down to give us hints of what is the thing that we're missing, to try and connect to things that we observe in nature that we know are there but that are not predicted by the standard model, such as dark matter, let's say.
You've been involved in some of the many measurements at Atlas.
Yeah, so more recently I've been working on the measurement of what we call a sort of monojet-like topology. And that is sort of kind of event where you have one very energetic object that doesn't seem to be balanced by anything, something that's missing. And that can happen in a standard model. You can have neutrinos that basically escape the detector
because they can't be detected.
They can't be detected, at least not by our detector. And so it looks like there's something missing there. And that's a very interesting measurement to make, because any sort of deviation from the level of how many of these types of events we expect from the standard model, if we actually see much more, then that's a hint of something beyond the standard model, which could be dark matter, for example. So this is one of the sort of flagship measurements that people are excited about, because it could show hints for what dark matter is if it shows up at the LHC. It might not, but if it does, then that would be a good candidate to observe it.
So you've been involved in the measurement, but not in the interpretation of the measurements just yet?
Kind of. People look for this, have done many years, and we've wanted to approach this with a new way of looking at this. Well, we went and measured the entire thing as we see it in the detector. So people typically know that there's various processes that could have a signature like that. And a lot of them are kind of uninteresting, so they try and subtract them and sort of leave the rest. That is the interesting bit. But that relies on the theory prediction that tells you what the composition is of everything that contributes to what we see in the detector. And we thought, why not just measure the whole thing as we see it and leave that prediction for the composition on the theory side, rather than making any statement on what we think is the fraction that we've measured. And the advantage of that then is really that you can take this and reinterpret this type of measurement much more easily in the future when you have different calculations, better calculations, or even different models that predict things that we haven't even considered at this time of making the measurement. So it makes it a lot more robust in that sense.
And that brings me to a question that some people might wonder about, which is that when you have these proton-proton collisions, you get a lot of debris because it's not just one proton colliding with another, it's actually quite a few. And so you get a lot of different particles that you may actually not be interested in. So you need to kind of filter out the noise from the actual experiments that you're interested in. I think one way of doing that is triggering all of that. But that itself can be quite complicated.
That is very complicated, yeah, because the LHC provides us with collision at an enormous rate of about 400 million collisions per second. And that is way too much to save that to disk. So we need what we call a triggering system that breaks down this rate to something that is more manageable and that we can actually store to disk. But that also puts a lot of pressure on the people developing the trigger to make sure that we don't miss anything interesting. But it's true that the vast majority of the collisions that occur are things that we have already measured in great detail, and they are not that interesting. So it's the artisan identifying the bits that look weird and keep those, but also have control triggers that are blind and unbiased in that sense. And it's a very complicated system that is, though, very successful at reducing the rate to something that we can manage and put to disk.
So at what level do the triggers actually come in? Is it right when the collisions take place? Is it then at the data analysis stage, or is it actually a multi-level trigger system where things are being filtered out as you go along?
It's a multi-layer stage. One is hardware-based and happens basically in real time as the collisions occur in the detector. That's very coarse and tries to sort of already reduce it significantly by a couple of orders of magnitude, and then puts it onto a dedicated computing farm where we have a software-based trigger to analyze in a bit more detail and break it down even further.
So just to finish off with the size of Atlas, as we said, it's as big as a house. According to the project's website, it's built like a cylinder which is 46 meters long and 25 meters wide. And yeah, you can probably fit a big house in that nicely. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, that you need a detector that huge as Atlas to measure particles that are really so small and extremely short-lived. But as Christian mentioned, there are millions and millions of proton-proton collisions each second, and each of which creates a whole avalanche of particles that form, for a brief instance, intermediate particles before they themselves decay into yet another cascade of particles. And to capture all of that, you need a whole range of different equipment. And it's not equipment you can buy off the shelf either. Rather, the building blocks of a detector are purpose-made, and some of it requires cutting-edge technology. The trigger system alone, the one that we just talked about, that is the system to filter out the data physicists are interested in amongst the vast quantity of data generated, is fiendishly complex. And you may wonder how on earth you can keep track of all of that. How can you manage this complex apparatus, not to mention understand what's actually going on inside? And this is one of the points, not the only one, mind you, where software comes in. Software used to build a model of the detector, which you can then peek into and simulate what happens if particles go through it, but also software that simulates the physics behind all of these particle interactions. These software models are usually referred to as Monte Carlo simulations, but they have nothing in common with the casinos. Rather, they try to emulate the detector and the physics as precisely as they can. In particular, the modeling of the physics requires a lot of theoretical understanding. After all, you start with a hypothesis which you then try to test in an experiment. Whereas on the other side, the modeling of a detector needs people who have a deep understanding of detector components and experimental setups. And this can sometimes, in my experience, lead to some divisions between the people doing the experiments and the people doing the theory. And so in the second part of my conversation with Chris, I started with asking about how theorists and experimentalists in large physics experiments such as ATLAS actually work together, before we then move on to the modeling itself. When people think of physicists, we have people in lab coats who run around the labs.
I think I've ever worn a lab coat in my time as a particle physicist.
Well, it's funnily enough, when you see films, then you often see people running around in lab coats. I can't remember now the film that I saw. I think it was Angels and Demons, which was one of those Dan Brown films where apparently somebody is stealing antiparticles from CERN. They've all been running around with lab coats, with white lab coats and glasses. And I thought, I've never seen anyone
That's right.
at CERN running around in lab coats. And if you try to steal antimatter, then good luck to you. But anyway, I think in high energy physics, or in particle physics perhaps particularly, there is this division between theory and experiment. And I'm not quite sure if that's the case in other areas of physics, where there's this kind of strict division. You know, these are the people who do the experiments, who get their hands dirty, and these are the ones who sit in front of their work farms, their engines, the computers, I mean. But I think you've been working actually with the theorists. You've been trying to bridge the gap between theory and experiment.
Yeah, that's right. So it's true. There's a bit of a divide between the theory community and the experimental community, but it's also a cycle and they inform each other. So the theory community that comes up with a model or uses software to try and simulate the standard model very precisely and even ever more precisely, provide the tools that we need in order to do our job. But at the same time, if we try and fill in the gaps of our knowledge, then whatever we measure has to feed back into the work of the theory community to try and improve that and give them a hint of what kind of model is the thing that could fill in those gaps. But they work on essentially very big software frameworks on each side. And there's also a community that's built around working on software tools that try and connect what comes out from the theory side and what is actually needed from the experiment side, and then vice versa. When you're done with a measurement, helps the theory community make use of what the experiments provide. And that's basically why I come in.
And that takes us to the subject of software.
Yeah.
And because modeling is obviously a very important part in all of this, and I remember that from my own days. So there's something called the Monte Carlo simulation. Part of that is to simulate the proton-proton collisions, I would imagine, or at least part of that. And the other one is, the simulation of the detector and how it responds to it. I mean, they're huge packages, of course, but could you break this down a little bit for us?
So the Monte Carlo event generators are the tools that provide us with the theory predictions that we need to interpret our data and understand our data. And they themselves are very large software frameworks, typically consisting of different submodules, focusing on specific aspects of trying to simulate parts of the theory. And there's the hard scatter that is sort of done from first principles, perturbation theory that sort of try and calculates from first principles the hard interaction at very high energies, but then you have to sort of simulate this all the way down to softer energies and lower energies, where perturbation theory will break down and you have to be a bit more clever and empirical about how to model this kind of thing.
What is perturbation theory? I mean, it's a disturbance of some kind, but what does it disturb?
Perturbation theory is fantastic. When you have a very complicated formula that you want to calculate and you can't easily do that, then perturbation theory is essentially saying it's doing it as Taylor expansion, if you're familiar from maths, that sort of tries to break this down into an infinite series of terms that become successively smaller. And you try and approximate the full thing by just calculating the first few terms, which tend to be a lot simpler than the full thing. And it gives us an approximate calculation of the full thing. And the more terms you calculate, the hope is that you converge to the full thing.
A little bit like a fuzzy term.
Slightly
it's a bit like. When we talk about the simulation of the proton-proton collisions, I guess this is something that can be done for ATLAS, certainly, but also, say, for CMS. I think they're looking also at
Absolutely. So this part is done by the theory community, and they provide the tools that does this independent of any detector. And all of the experiments will use these tools to simulate the kind of processes that may occur at the Large Hadron Collider. all of the experiments. And the experiments then themselves, they take these things as input and run their dedicated detector simulation over them to simulate how their respective detector would respond to these kind of particles. And we're talking about, the typical collision event has hundreds of particles in that, and they will interact with your detector and the material in the detector in some way. And that is in itself a very costly and time-expensive thing to simulate, because these detectors have hundreds of millions of cells.
Yeah, no, I think we come to that in a minute, because that simulation needs to be specific to a experiment.
That's
but
right.
The modeling itself, so what languages, is it a whole range of different languages that it's written in? And how it can be envisaged, that kind of software, that massive software package?
Yeah, it's the vast majority of the heavy lifting is actually done in C++. There were certainly still tools around in Fortran and codes that have originally been written in Fortran and were then ported to C++. But the vast majority of the simulation work is done in C++, and then later on, most of the work is done. People typically use Python to do a bit of processing.
So when I'm sitting in front of a workstation at CERN, or probably here at UCL as well, because they're linked, so how can I do then a run of proton-proton simulation? How long would that take?
It depends on the kind of process and the precision that you want to go for. So I was talking earlier about the perturbation theory. If you just calculate the first term, we call that the leading order. They're typically super fast, and you can do this on your laptop and get a lot of events out in a very short amount of time. But then if you want to, but it's not necessarily a very good and accurate prediction that you might get out of that. But so if you then want to include the next terms, the higher order terms, we typically refer to this as next to leading order, next to leading order, and so on.
Yeah.
That will blow up the time needed to calculate this, yes.
And also probably won't run on your local laptop anymore. You need to run that on a...
Yeah, depending on the complexity, it will not run on your laptop. And typically, we will have to run this on a cluster system. And CERN itself, in fact, provides us with the grid, the LHC computing grid, which is essentially a network of clusters around the world at different universities and institutes, where jobs are dispatched and highly parallelized and distributed to get that job done, break it down and get it done.
Well, that would make an interesting episode in its own right, I guess.
Absolutely.
But I think we're not going to go there yet. When we look at these Monte Carlo simulations from a physics point of view, software has bugs and all of that. So how can I make sure that the results I'm getting are actually consistent, at least with the physics we know so far? Is there some kind of checkpoint?
A lot of work goes into validating. It depends a bit what aspect you're trying to validate. You can always compare simulated and real data and check things like whether the number of particles and the energy of the particles that you're seeing is somewhat what you expect from the real data in a controlled data set, let's say. You can also, what's very popular is use benchmark processes, things that we have measured very, very well over the decades and know very well, and simulate that, and then make sure that the various effects that are being simulated are well reproduced from that data that we have already measured. And of course, cross-checking between different models. So they have multiple theory groups working on different approaches to produce these kind of calculations. It's important to look at as many of them as possible and see where the outliers are and to understand them. But of course, if they all agree with each other, then that gives you some confidence that you understand what's going on.
And you wrote a paper, didn't you, describing the accelerating event generation for Large Hadron Colliders?
Yeah, that's right. So this was quite interesting because one of these tools we heavily use in the ATLAS experiment, specifically to calculate processes that happen very frequently that are kind of showing up in all of the analyses. So this is the bulk processes that is kind of your bread and butter simulation. And we put a lot of CPU in these samples because they are used by so many analyses. You want to have the best possible calculation that you can have for these kind of processes. But they're also very slow. And it looked like a major bottleneck going forward that we would not be able to sustain this over the years. And knowing that from the ATLAS side, I went and worked with the theorists to figure out how can we do this, but more efficiently. Not necessarily getting better modeling or better calculation out, but just let's stick to what we're currently doing, just try and do it better and figure out how we can restructure things such that it fits better with how we do our Monte Carlo event samples and our production. And that was nice to get all the relevant people in the same room to discuss really what the problems are and different angles that we could try and iteratively trying to make it better. And it worked really well.
Software and software development, as you may have guessed, plays a crucial part in experiments like ATLAS, from modeling detectors and the physics, as we've just heard, but also the analysis of this mountain of data that are being recorded, the running of the experiments themselves, and of course the software to manage all of the infrastructure that you need to do all of this. And so it's perhaps not surprising that CERN is not only the home for fundamental research, but also to some cutting-edge software development. In previous episodes, I introduced you to some of the projects, like the conversation I had with Laura Pomberger and Jakob Blomer about a virtual file system. I can tell you a lot of software engineering careers were forged at CERN and CERN experiments, or in particle physics in general. But it's not always what we hope we would be doing in our professional lives. And I can speak for myself here. I actually wanted to make a career in physics. But alas, like so many of us, I ended up in software engineering. And so in the final part of this interview, I wanted to find out from Chris what he expected when he started at ATLAS. What I'm hearing is that it involves a lot of computing, writing software, reviewing software, maintaining software. Is that actually what you expected when you joined ATLAS? Is that what you wanted to do when you joined ATLAS?
I expected it would involve a lot of software and writing software, and that's also kind of what I wanted to do. I wasn't prepared for the scale of it. We weren't really prepared for that as physicists. No, we're not trained software developers. No. We're trained to write software for data analysis, but we're not really trained in the software engineering practices that you kind of need for the scale of this problem.
And that is a problem actually when you deal with complex software such as Monte Carlo simulation, the data analysis and all of that. So how is ATLAS dealing with all of that? So if I'm a newcomer, I'm joining the ATLAS team, is there some kind of onboarding or something like that?
Yeah, there's some kind of onboarding. There's training that is being provided to upskill the students that are coming in that might not have the necessary background to deal with Git and all of these things. It's also important to interdisciplinary hiring and not just have physicists in there, but specifically also hire software experts that can make sure that the thing that is being taught matches with what is currently state of the art in the industry, let's say.
So you do hire software engineers as well? I mean, specifically software engineers.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. So another important subject that we haven't touched on, because you generate a lot of data.
That's right.
And you do a lot of analysis, and you've been doing some work on how all of that is preserved. So let's say the Higgs boson was discovered, when was it, 2011, 2012, around about that time? I can't remember now. I should remember, but I don't.
2012.
2012. At least that's when the presentation was. But let's say in 20 years' time, somebody wants to rerun the analysis because they think, well, maybe something we need to check again. How would we be able to do that?
That's a very good question. And that is something where we can always do better than we currently do or have done in the past. I think what we're already doing pretty well is the experimental data that is published and finalized and comes out in a paper is all digitized and uploaded to an online database called HepData. That's basically stored there, and you can export that in all kinds of different formats, and it is fantastic for the community to access the actual numerical data from measurements from the last decades and use that. And it's all open access and open source, and it's a fantastic tool. But that by itself doesn't necessarily allow you to reproduce what was done, because you also need to know what the analysis logic was, the sort of actual codes that was used in order to produce this kind of measurement.
And the workflow.
And that we haven't traditionally done such a good job at preserving. It's described in the papers, but typically, at least in my experience, the language that is used can be very ambiguous. And if you try and code up a snippet of C++ based on the English wording, there's ambiguities in there that are difficult to resolve. And if you have access to the original people that have worked on this, then you can resolve this. But if they leave and disappear, then what are you going to do? And so we've worked on a tool called RIVET, which stands for Robust and Independent Validation of Experiment and Theory. It's a contrived acronym, of course. And the idea is there to be a library of little C++ snippets that encode the actual logic that was used in a given measurement and sync that against HEP data to superimpose the actual experimental data. And the idea was to do it in such a way that you can run this over all of your Monte Carlo samples and independently of the different Monte Carlo samples and whatever weird little differences they might have in the format, but be really agnostic about that and provide a common framework for both theory and experiment to exchange this logic.
And I think you're now one of the core developers for this, aren't you?
Yeah, I've kind of grown into this. I started out as a user. I used this for my master's project originally, and then I used it during my PhD as well. And realize the value in having these snippets and being able to reproduce this and to validate against is also very crucial for validating your new Monte Carlo samples, because you have this big suite of existing measurements. And I pushed my colleagues to provide these samples when they finished an analysis, and via this route became a core developer in the end.
Is that what you're going to do in future then, or what's in store for you?
I don't know. It's a good question. This project is one that's very close to my heart. I've worked on this for probably 10 years now.
Oh, wow.
And I'm certainly interested in keeping it alive. As long as people are finding the need for it and want to use it, I'm happy to support it.
And what's in store for Atlas? LHC, I think, was offline for a while because I think there was some maintenance. But, I mean, machines like that have to be maintained, and so it's closed down. But I think they started having runs again, don't they?
Yeah, so we actually shut down every year over the Christmas period, or the winter period, let's say, to save a bit on the energy bill, as it were. And then they typically start back up in the spring again. Even though we have a sort of winter stop at the moment, we are still in run mode. It's called Run 3. And then there will be a longer shutdown of several years where we really upgrade our detectors and replace the parts, because these things were down. There's a lot of radiation, as you can imagine, around the interaction point, and things break down over time. And then the upcoming longer shutdown, we have to replace a lot of parts of Atlas to the extent that we'll basically have a new detector afterwards. And then when we restart after that, that's going to be the phase where we really ramp up the data volume that is being delivered by the LHC, and where we ramp up the measurement phase, because we've basically only covered about 10% of the data that we expect to record.
Okay. The big stuff is still coming.
That's still coming, yeah.
I would like to finish to give people a flavor of what a run actually looks like and how that is organized. CERN is a big organization, and Atlas is actually not directly, the experiment itself is actually outside the main CERN campus.
That's right.
I think in France even, isn't it?
No, it's still on the Swiss side, but the LHC, the accelerator, is a large tunnel of 27 kilometer in size that is basically set on part is on the Swiss side and part is on the French side. And the 4 interaction points are around that ring. Atlas is on the Swiss side, but CMS, for example, another big multi-purpose detector, is on the French side.
Can CMS and Atlas run in parallel, or do they have to coordinate with each other? Hey, I'm taking all the proton-proton collisions now.
No, they all run in parallel. So the LHC delivers the collisions at all 4 interaction points in parallel.
And when there is a run, I think it's all hands on deck then, isn't it?
Yeah, we have control rooms where we have shifters, and that are there the entire time during a run. Different institutes might handle this differently. UCL, for example, prefers to send their PhD students out because it's a great opportunity to take part in their own experiments and be able to sit in the control room, understand how this data taking actually works, and then feel a connection to their experiment.
I do remember that there's always something to do. I mean, I've been involved in a much, much smaller experiment in my past. It was actually quite stressful at times to be involved in the run, because you get the beam for a limited period of time. At least at the time that was the case. I don't know how LHC is organized, but then things have to happen because you have kind of experimental goals, right? You would like to measure this and you would like to measure that, and does the trigger work and does the trigger that? Is that the same for Atlas then? Is there sometimes the big hectic and the big chaos and the big panic breaking out in the control room?
Yeah, it's this can happen certainly when we start back up after winter break. and make sure that everything's still running smoothly. Or if the LHC changes their configuration and mixes things up, tries to deliver collisions a bit more intensively than it may have done in the past, then it can be a bit hectic. But once it runs smoothly, it's quite calm.
Says he, with rolling eyes. Well, anyway, thank you very much for your time, Christian.
Thank you for having me.
I hope this episode gave you at least a small impression of what it's like to work at one of the biggest particle physics experiments there is, ATLAS. Chris mentioned the CERN summer school a bit earlier. I myself didn't actually go there, but whenever I talked to people who did, they told me they enjoyed it and learned a lot, and that for them it was often a career or even perhaps a life-changing moment. So do look out for the CERN summer school program if you're interested. Next week, we're going to look into something a lot less complex and big, but no less impactful, the fellowship program of the Software Sustainability Institute in the UK, and you can meet my guests Esther, Mike and Nico. And just before we end, please consider supporting the show. You find an online tipping jar in the show notes. Thanks a million and see you next week. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.